Hello and welcome back to the Periphery. This week we have a very exciting guest. You might recall that season one we had Bill Kovacic, the former chair of the FTC. Well, today we have the direct successor, Jon Leibowitz, who was the FTC chair during the Obama administration, who oversaw kind of one of the most, I would say, and this is my opinion, Jess, maybe you all can correct me, but I say one of the most pivotal eras in tech today. He was there in 2000, was it 9 to 13? Well,
Yeah,
hello,
and
John.
even before that, I actually was a Democratic commissioner from 2000 on a Republican-controlled commission from 2004 to 2000, early 2009.
And I mean, just let's just dive in. Can you kind of give us like an overview of your career at the FTC and just what your role was and some of the things that you saw? And, you know, today, obviously, we kind of understand tech as big, perhaps bad, perhaps scary boogeyman, controlling a lot of DC and federal policy. But then it was a very different story. It was tech's on the rise. It was, America's new industry. And the Obama administration was, very cozy with tech.
Well, Avi, that's right. And let me just start by saying thank you all on the Periphery for inviting me to join your podcast. So I was, and I think the way you put it is exactly right. I came to the FTC in 2004, and for those of you who don't know it, the FTC was maybe a little bit less now. But was about as bipartisan an agency as you could possibly have in Washington. Commissioners, Democrats and Republicans talked to each other. We made collective decisions. We rarely had 3-2 party line votes. And we made our decision making and our education and our learning, I think, better by bringing different areas of expertise to the table, and by always sort of thinking about what's the best way to effectuate our mission. People had different views about how to do that, but everybody agreed that the FTC should be about consumer protection, stopping unfair or deceptive acts or practices, about competition, stopping unfair methods of competition. That's sort of a broader sort of a penumbra around the antitrust laws. And we were learning a lot about privacy at the time. So when I first came to the FTC, there was a problem with spyware. Now there is no problem with spyware, and that's because the FTC went after the malefactors who were putting malware in people's computers that were serving ads that they couldn't find, and we shut those companies down. But we were learning a lot about the tech companies as they were growing, right? And I think they went from, as I watched them. And we did some meaningful things around tech company and consumer privacy and antitrust. But as we watched them, they I think in retrospect, I would certainly say they went from these cool companies that were doing great things for consumers to, and this happens in different industries as well, to monopolists who are trying to protect their position. Some would say legally, some of us thought not so legally in certain circumstances, and to companies that were sort of hoovering up data. We started calling them cyberazzi, and doing it in a way that was undermining consumer control of personally identifiable information. So we watched the landscape change when. By the time I became chair, we started scrutinizing these companies, I think, in considerably more depth. And we brought cases against Facebook and Google and Twitter for basically deceiving consumers about the data they were collecting and who they were giving it to. But to your question, we could see the landscape changing, and we could see, idealistic companies becoming considerably losing some of their idealism, I would say.
John, I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind rewinding a bit for us. A lot of us are soon to be graduates or in school. You graduated law school from NYU in 1984. which jumped out to me given the book title of the same name. I'm wondering if at that point the tech industry was on your radar as a big promise, but also a big threat, and if not, how that interest was ignited in the early stages of your legal career.
No. If you want me to sort of frolic and detour a little bit to what I was thinking about when I graduated law school, and my daughter, by the way, is finishing up her third year at Harvard this spring, law school, and refuses to work for a law firm because she says her father did it, and so she doesn't need to.
Hey, that's a very fair argument.
I was thinking about none of these things. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I turned down my law firm offers, and I came to Washington, and then ended up, and I wanted to work in politics, which I ultimately ended up doing. I worked on the Hill for 12 or 13 years for the late Paul Simon, and then for Herb Kohl. Wonderful, two wonderful senators. Herb Kohl was a senator from Wisconsin, and but no, I hadn't really thought about technology or antitrust that much. It was just not, technology issues were just not on the radar screen of my peers in the way that they are now, for your peers. And antitrust, I came late to. I got interested in antitrust when I started working in the Senate, and then as Senator Kohl got more senior, and he was a progressive business person from Wisconsin, he ended up chairing different subcommittees. And in my last 3 or 4 years with him, he chaired the antitrust subcommittee, and I got really interested in antitrust issues. And then I had a little detour of my own to go work for the film industry for a few years, and it was a glamorous job, but it was kind of like utterly non-substantive, and or largely non-substantive. And then I had an opportunity to go onto the FTC. I was just the luckiest. It was just totally serendipitous. Although I had background in competition policy from being the chief counsel of the antitrust subcommittee, and I went there, and I learned about all sorts of issues, technology issues, antitrust issues, healthcare competition issues, which were a big part of our agenda, privacy issues, which were a big part of our agenda, and had a wonderful time at this great small agency.
So I think that's like kind of a perfect way to situate ourselves into today. You're talking about the landscape of antitrust and how it's kind of evolved throughout your career. Now the antitrust regime is quite different than the one you entered. It's not particularly bipartisan. The understanding of how these markets operate has totally shifted, in no small part due to the current chair, Lena Khan, and her paper on the Amazon's antitrust paradox. And so, there's kind of two questions that remain with this current regime. One, how much can antitrust really do? And at the same time, what was the second question that I had? How much can antitrust actually do, and how seriously should we take the concerns of these Neo-Brandeisians, where privacy is the market, data is the market, and it's not really reflected in consumer prices?
So let me take those questions in order, and they're big meaty questions. I would say that antitrust can do a lot if it's properly interpreted. So, and this is where I think the Neo-Brandeisians have done a very good job of questioning conventional wisdom and making people think, at least some people think, a little bit differently about antitrust. And on some issues, and I can come back to this, the consensus has changed as a result of the Neo-Brandeisians, even though I think, probably most people, certainly on the defense side in the antitrust community, don't like to call them Neo-Brandeisians. They like to call them hipster antitrust people, as a derogatory way.
They're quite mainstream for hipster.
They may be. So if you look, there has been really only, the antitrust laws in the last 30 years have been, for the most part, about the courts redefining antitrust in a fairly cramped way. But one of our biggest victories, and it was not me, it was the entire commission, who was foursquare behind this, was winning a case in the Supreme Court to stop pay for delay pharmaceutical deals. Now, those deals are ones in which the brand pharmaceutical company would pay the generic pharmaceutical company to stay out of the market. And that was win-win for the companies, but it was lose-lose for consumers who were footing the bill. And that win in the Supreme Court 5-3 in the Actavis case in 2013, that has saved consumers in healthcare costs literally since then, maybe $100 billion, and maybe more, because if the Supreme Court had decided the other way, these deals would have gone on for would have become much more prevalent. And so I believe antitrust can do many important. Hold on a second, I have something. Sorry. Can do really important things for consumers and for competition. And if you believe that competition is the best way to benefit Americans and to benefit consumers, then it can be really important. I do think that the way the competition laws are interpreted now, it's hard to win cases. And indeed, I'm not so sure we would have won our Actavis case, which we won 5-3 with this Supreme Court. It's and in all the other cases at the Supreme Court, and most, but not all, appellate court decisions, the loser has certainly when the agencies are involved, the loser has more often than not been the government, and the government represents, or at least tries to, the people. So I guess I finish answering that question by saying, when I was at the FTC for 8.5 years, I kind of believed that the answer was more enlightened judges that gave a little more deference to antitrust agencies. And now, in the wake of 10 more years and 236 Trump-appointed judges,
206?
236? Yeah.
Oh wow.
They were very efficient. And some of those judges are very good. So I don't mean to, I don't mean to say that that I'm averse to all of them. I'm not. But in the wake of those judges that were appointed, who are for the most part conservative on antitrust and consumer protection issues and agency deference, we probably need to change the laws, because like the antitrust laws, a magnificently broad delegation of power to the courts and to the agencies. They're just certainly in the near and intermediate future, they're just not going to be interpreted differently. So the antitrust laws are about promoting and ensuring competition to benefit consumers. And if they're not doing, if the courts can't interpret it properly, you need to change the law. So that only answered your first question. Why don't you ask the second question again for our listeners on the periphery?
It's more about, there's all these concerns. I think the Neo-Brandeisians are concerned about how big these companies are. They're concerned about kind of the surveillance capitalism, so-called, that they're ushering in. Mm-hmm. And but it's not very clear on how to remedy that. So it's kind of a two-pronged question. It's just, what are the remedies, or what is the metric of success? Is it in these companies? Is it making Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp separate companies? How do you actually undermine that business model that kind of incentivizes these conglomerates, these huge mega $1 trillion companies?
Right. Well, I guess I take a slightly different perspective, but not entirely different, in the sense that I think if you get to your big dominant position by virtue of the impressive technology that you've developed, that's not a problem for me. The problem, I think, comes when you engage in what the antitrust lawyers would call exclusionary acts, bad acts that effectuate that either involve attempted monopolization or monopoly maintenance. And I think there's some evidence that some of the large tech companies have done that. There's certainly multiple lawsuits against Google and Facebook at this point, and they are very serious. And we had a long investigation when I was at the FTC, even before these monopolies were as durable as we now know them to be, where there was quite candidly a split in the commission about whether we should bring an action against Google. Some of us wanted to, majority didn't, and so we didn't. And I think these cases are serious. So we'll have to see where antitrust goes. How these cases come out. I do kind of think that they are. And I'll give you another example too. So the FTC has a case against Facebook to undo some of its acquisitions, Instagram, WhatsApp, and the better time to have done that would have been when they tried to buy these companies, and there just wasn't a will of the majority of the commission to bring an action. But going back to the Neo-Brandeisians, one of the areas where I think things would change now, if in the sort of Facebook Instagram acquisition, or I wasn't at the commission during Facebook WhatsApp, and they didn't even go to what's known as second request, a deeper dive on that. But one area that we struggled with on the commission in merger reviews was, what do we do about the large dominant company buying a new entrant with interesting technology that has no market share? So that's Facebook, Instagram, right? And some wanted to bring that case, knowing we would probably lose, because you look at market share, if you're, but to send a signal, right? To say, look, we're going to be scrutinizing these deals. Other people thought that no, the market share doesn't change. We'd lose that case, and I think we probably would have, and it wasn't appropriate, because really you should look at increased market share rather than, and Instagram at that time had no advertising or almost no advertising revenue, right? So what's known as, for those of you who've taken antitrust, you look at the HHIs. If you see a big delta, I see people smiling because you had to learn that stuff. And if you see a big delta and an increase to a concentration level, then it's a presumptively illegal transaction. But here the deltas didn't change. There was no more increased. The HHIs didn't go up because one company had a dominant market position. The other company had zero market position. They had no advertisers. So I think today Republicans and Democrats would look at that with much more, would scrutinize a deal like that much more. And that's an area where I think it's important. So that's another area where antitrust can be effective, right? Is stopping dominant companies from buying new competitors. And I think that's an area that's changing, and where antitrust is actually going to be more forceful in protecting consumers. As for other parts of the Neo-Brandeisian agenda, I think there's too much. I would say this. I agree with a lot of it. I'm probably not a charter member. I am probably something more like a fellow traveler. But I think we all should agree there's too much concentration. The antitrust laws in there, as they've been effectuated, have let too much concentration come about through mergers. And you always need, I think if you believe in the marketplace of ideas, you are always better off with hearing, with having a forceful group on the left that that's sort of an advocacy. Not a group, but people who advocate for a particular position, because then you listen to them. And these Neo-Brandeisians, Lena Khan, Tim Wu, who worked at the FTC for me when I was at the commission, and who would be if you haven't had him on the Periphery, he would be a great guest. And I know, and one of you guys teaches, one of you guys is at Columbia, where Tim is back teaching. So, so I would encourage you to bring him on. So Lena and Tim are probably the two most important people in this world. Maybe Barry Lynn at the Open Markets Institute, who's been an advocate. We're better off when there's a marketplace of ideas where everyone can have their say, and the people who are appointed to enforce the law can listen to them and learn from them, and disagree with them sometimes too.
When I think of the Neo-Brandeisian movement, I think of this idea that antitrust might be a useful vessel for problems that, on first blush might not seem like competition problems, though they're arguably downstream of competition problems. So instead of price fixing, we're talking about consumer privacy, for example. But of course, something like consumer privacy doesn't exist in a vacuum, and any antitrust regulations could have ripple effects that go beyond the scope of American industry. I'm thinking specifically of the national security context, and there's probably a debate to be had about whether antitrust's goal of fostering innovation by focusing on protecting incentives to innovate overlooks or blocks another path to innovation, namely information sharing and combining capabilities. But that aside, I'm wondering whether national security dynamics are a consideration within FTC decision-making, or maybe whether you personally see those as being intertwined.
Well, so let's unpack that a little bit. So national security issues are sort of on the periphery of the FTC. But I happen to be having dinner with a high-ranking current government official, a cabinet person, last night, and just coincidentally, and we were talking. He was talking about the work he was doing with the FTC, my former agency, on some national security issues. So they do come up, and it was probably a cross-agency initiative involving the SEC as well. So those issues do come up, even if they're not in the core of the agency's jurisdiction. I guess I would say, to your other point, you can't use antitrust to solve the world's problems. You can use antitrust to solve competition problems. And sometimes, by the way, the market is the market for the collection of data. And so, so antitrust can be useful in ensuring ensuring a more even playing field for data collection, I suppose, and that's important. But when it comes to a variety of problems in society, for example, wealth disparities and civil rights issues, which are talked about in the Neo-Brandeisian world as things that antitrust should be looking at. I don't think under most circumstances you can reach those problems. And although it is terribly dysfunctional and has been for quite some time, the way to respond to those problems is often it's often better to have the legislature or lawmakers or Congress do it. So let me just, and I want to come back to privacy for 1 second, if I can. So the FTC has now started. So 11 years ago, we wrote a major report when I was at the commission because on privacy and the need for better privacy protections. And it was kind of designed as a guide to lawmakers to pass a privacy law. For 10 years, we have been waiting for that privacy law to pass. I've actually been doing pro bono work on it. There's been some signs of Congress waking up in the last year.
Seriously? Do people think that they'll get a bill passed?
Well, I am unduly optimistic about this. I think they're going to pass a bill in the House. And I think they're going to pass a bill in the House, and there'll be a lot of pressure to pass something in the Senate. Last year, a bill came out of the Energy and Commerce Committee by a 53-2 vote. And ironically, the person who was holding it up was Nancy Pelosi because she was getting some bad advice from people. But
This is just by far the most optimistic, the most by a lot I've heard about privacy.
Well, if you have me back in 2 years, I'll probably be eating some crow on this, but I hope not. And so my point about the FTC is, after 10 years of anemic response, even though there's a huge bipartisan support for privacy legislation, Congress hasn't gotten it done, and the FTC is taking a shot at a privacy regulation. Now, I think that's actually a really good thing for the commission to do. And I'm also very supportive of the commission's initiative, which is more of a competition initiative on non-competes, to ban non-compete clauses, because, even if they're not really enforceable, if you work at McDonald's, you're not likely to know when your boss tells you you're not allowed to go to, Burger King and get $3 more an hour. You may not know that they're not enforceable. So I think these are great initiatives, but one is, they will be tested by a conservative judiciary, right? Under major questions doctrine, a sort of, kind of fairly new doctrine that was kind of, off in the distant right until recently, and now is, part of Supreme Court jurisprudence. And it would be better if Congress, if Congress passed laws in these areas rather than the FTC trying to initiate a rulemaking. I don't blame them for doing this. I think they're doing exactly what they should do. And particularly on the non-competes, it's very much a Neo-Brandeisian initiative. We're consistent with their views, and I'm strongly supportive of it. But at the end of the day, whether it's privacy or whether it's non-competes or something else, better for Congress, or junk fees, which is another great initiative at the FTC. It's better for it's better for Congress to pass these laws. Doesn't mean you shouldn't take a shot down the field, but they're only you are stronger, at least in effectuating things, when you play within your wheelhouse, as opposed to at the outer limits of it.
This might be an impossible task on your hand, but on the privacy bill that you're working on, are there 1 to 2 elements of that bill you might be able to sort of talk about in further insight? Because I think in the absence of federal privacy law, we've seen states taking varied approaches to privacy. And I'm curious, are there 1 or maybe 1 to 2 points that you think the federal government should be focusing on?
Sure. I'm happy to try to answer that. So the first thing is, you're right to observe states starting to passing privacy laws. California was the first, and it deserves a fair amount of credit for being that.
West Coast,
right? It shows that lawmakers can actually pass a privacy law, but California's law is not particularly strong. You can transfer all sorts of data. You can suck up information. It's not.
It's very permissive.
It's very permissive.
Yeah.
The ADPPA, which is and to the extent that there have been a number of other states, Connecticut recently, Virginia fairly recently, Colorado,
Illinois,
that have passed privacy
I was
laws.
gonna say BIP in
Illinois has a biometric law. They've been fairly permissive as well, and they've been written with the secret hand of large technology companies supporting them. So, if the large technology companies mostly support them, you should question whether, those are the laws that really empower consumers.
Yeah.
Okay. In the ADPPA, at the core, my view of the core of the ADPPA, right? And remember, legislation in Washington it's the art of the possible. It's not the best. It's not what could be the strongest. But the legislation at its core says 2 things. One is, you have to have a real ability to opt out from collection of data. Actually, it's not collection of data. It's use of data for certain purposes and transfer of data. I would probably do it at collection. And and replicate something closer to, if I could wave my magic wand, and replicate something closer to the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, which prohibits the collection of data without parental consent. Having said that, the ability to opt out, if there's a clear, easy to exercise consumer opt out for the collection of data for certain purposes, that's important. And then when you deal with categories of sensitive information, so think of healthcare information not within HIPAA or financial information, companies have to get an affirmative express consent. So something stronger than, but like an opt-in for you to use your information. And they can't say to you, take it or leave it. They can't make you a take it or leave it bargain. And the other thing it does is it would increase. So there's a kind of an opt-in affirmative express consent approach, right? I think they're trying to decide whether they want to keep the same regime for first and third parties or have it tighter for third parties than for first parties. That's a reasonable debate to have. Another thing it does, which I think is critical, is it raises the COPPA age. Doesn't do it quite like by raising COPPA, but effectively raises the COPPA age from 12 and under to 16 and under. And you know what? When COPPA was passed, the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act in 1999, I think 1999, maybe it's 2000. We just didn't know. I mean, there wasn't this kind of persistent and extraordinary data collection that we see now. In fact, in 2012, we updated the regulations around COPPA, and all of the commissioners said if we had the power to do it, we'd raise the age. And one thing we did was we put limits on precise geolocation information, which we could do because in 1999 or 2000, whenever COPPA passed, nobody had ever heard of precise geolocation information, at least no one who was writing that law. But they gave us enough regulatory authority at the FTC so that we could write a regulation or a rule that prohibited that kind of collection without parental consent. And what parent is going to give parental consent to collecting kids' geolocation information? So I think at its core, limits on the use of data, limits on the transfer of data, raising the effective age of COPPA, creating a private right of action. It's attenuated, but it's there. And ensuring, by the way, and I should probably mention this is a core principle of the legislation, ensuring that any discriminatory acts offline would be treated as discriminatory acts online. So you can't essentially, if the use of AI becomes discriminatory, right, a clear statement and a clear law that says that's discrimination. Just because it's online, it's not different from other discrimination.
Speaking of, if I turn on immersive view, you'll see immediately, like here, see, like usually with me specifically, it does not work. But hey, this is pretty good. This is the first time
I get to sit with all these young, bright students. I'm very excited.
Yeah, John. In the same vein of Adam's question, in the absence of comprehensive federal legislation, I think we've seen other executive agencies flexing their powers as well. The White House, the DOJ, especially in the privacy realm, with the executive order on signals intelligence in the fall, the DOJ's new data protection court, all of those things kind of do align U.S. surveillance standards with the EU's. So I guess I have two questions. First, broadly, what do you make of this effort to kind of align EU-U.S. standards for the purpose of data transfers? And then second of all, do these regulations do enough? Again, with the caveat.
Well, there's always a question about whether the regulations do enough, and the previous regime of sharing was thrown out by the data transfers was thrown out by the European High Court or Court of First Instance, and so we had to So we had to rewrite the regulations or the circumstances under which data can be transferred. So I tend I strongly believe we have to have. I mean, one of the reasons why we want a federal privacy law is because data doesn't remain in any particular state, right? And you don't want a crazy quilt patchwork of conflicting state laws. And the truth is, as you know, data doesn't remain data doesn't necessarily remain in any country, and and consumers are benefited sometimes, not always, when data transfers are facilitated. So I think you have to have a regime that does that. Is this regime strong enough in terms of protecting consumers? I don't know the answer to that. But I'd also say that if you can bring actions against companies that are malefactors and are violating privacy laws, whether it's the regime in the EU or whether it's a hopefully soon to be regime in the United States, or just the FTC Act, which is the fallback. That's part of the way in which you ensure that data transfers are consistent with consumer sovereignty. And then to the extent that there are questions, and they're very legitimate ones, about government surveillance, right, which has sort of animated some of the concerns in Europe. Those are also really gnarly, and we as a society need to keep on working on them, because we don't want government to needlessly or without a important justification, like the potential for imminent harm. We don't want government, I think, collecting information on citizens.
I mean, I have a short answer to your question. I'm going to know it doesn't go far enough, but that's my own opinion.
I think one other piece of insight that would be interesting, to me at least, we've spent a lot of today talking about big tech, and I think most, if not all of us, could talk about big tech for a long time. But I'm curious if there are other industries, I think you mentioned big pharma earlier, other industries that you think merit more airtime in the public discourse about antitrust.
Oh, that's a great question. I at the FT. Well, let me just step back a little bit. We always took an approach that's sort of utilitarian or Benthamite. I guess Jeremy Bentham is the person who coined this phrase: "Greatest good for the greatest number of people." So how can you be the most opportunistic in stopping things that harm consumers? So at that time, it was certainly particular bad acts by the pharmaceutical industry. Also has spent a lot of time on other healthcare issues like hospital mergers, because a lot of times hospitals want to merge and nonprofits act like for-profits. A lot of hospital companies are nonprofits, but they don't act like nonprofits. And those hospital mergers increase costs. So we spend a lot of time on healthcare. I still think healthcare is an enormously important area for antitrust, right? And pharmaceutical companies are always trying, brands and generics, to game the system in different ways to increase their profits, and they all treat the Hatch-Waxman Act, which is the pathway for generic entry, as whack-a-mole. How can we elide around this? If they're eliding around this, how can we elide around that? Pay for delay pharmaceuticals, where the brands paid off the generics, was really the most noxious, because it was the two sides colluding at a high level, and companies colluding at a very specific level. So healthcare, I think, is really important. It's healthcare is a huge proportion of the GDP in the United States. That's not, I think it's something like 18%. That's not sustainable, and it's not acceptable. So you go where the money is, right? Tech is a big area for, I think there's a reason why people talk about big tech when they talk about technology, when they talk about antitrust. And that's because these dominant companies are the biggest companies in the world, and and there's a high level of concentration in each of their complementary industries, and they're not really entering into each other's markets. as often as we'd like to see them. There's a little of that. And, we benefit with more competition, we consumers around the world. But I also sort of, you know, so I think of those as two of the biggest areas. I would probably, if I could rewrite the antitrust laws, I probably wouldn't change them only for companies with over $600 billion in market cap.
Judd.
I'd probably change the case law, a lot of
That
the
was
case law
awesome.
over the last 20 or 30 years, so it applies in any marketplace. It makes mergers harder. It makes monopolization cases or unfair methods of competition.
That was so interesting.
Unfair methods
I
of
didn't even
competition
know
cases easier to
Congress was
win
getting close
for the
to
Justice
passing
Department's
federal
antitrust
legislation on
division for the
privacy.
FTC.
Right.
I think it's.
I was gonna say, I'm
when
so
people get
excited to
interested
email
in
all my
antitrust
privacy
through
professors being like, you
concerns
wouldn't
about big
believe what I
tech
just heard.
is a perfectly good way to think about it, but you are
No, not
you are
yet.
right, Jessica.
It
is more than just big
two
tech
things on
as it
that.
should be.
One, do we
It's
know
pretty
when we're going to
interesting that
release
it's
this
like big
episode?
tech and healthcare and this whole biotech emergence coming to
Okay,
like, this
because I'm going to
between
follow
all
up
the
with them
other
asking
jobs.
that, and I'm just going to say,
since
hey,
I
we
left
actually
my big
also
law firm that,
Leibowitz today. Just a heads up, that'll be released in 2
that
weeks
did a
as
lot
well.
of representation of a particular big tech company, though I did not do that, and pharmaceutical companies too. I've been helping out you mentioned biotech, and I've been helping out a small biotech company with a small medical technology company with a terrific new product that they've just entered the market with. And the incumbent, what has the incumbent done? The incumbent, which has no competition, a 90% plus market share in this market, basically cut its prices to below cost, at or below cost, to try to like knock the new competitor out, right? That's predatory pricing. That's an antitrust violation. So you have to just, you have to keep an eye on the entire marketplace because you need to, because wherever there are companies, there's the possibility for anti-competitive behavior. That doesn't mean every company does it. Most companies do not. But if you're not policing the marketplace, the antitrust division and the FTC, then consumers will be the victims, right? Other companies too, but mostly consumers, right?
Hi, I'm wondering, so you did this challenging work for a number of years, but I'm wondering if you have any favorite moments or memories that you would like to share with us, and in addition, if you happen to have any advice for young people.
My favorite memories, what are my favorite memories from being at the FTC? Just because it was a wonderful agency where everyone was committed to the mission of what we wanted to do, and the commissioners themselves, sat around tables and tried to figure out, like, how do we help consumers? How do we ensure there's competition? We didn't always agree. We had some very substantive disagreements, but we always respected each other, and we always tried to do what we thought was right. So that was a and every day I would come into the office. So this is not one moment, but it's every day I come into the office and I would think, what kind of cool thing can I do for consumers today? This is like the from a psychic income perspective, it was the best job I have ever had or ever will have. And it's an independent agency too. I think the Supreme Court is going to get rid of independent agencies in a few years, unfortunately. And they won't be quite so independent, even if there's still commissions with people from both sides of the aisle. And we really believed in the independence of our agency. At that time, we never, we kept away from, both during the Bush administration when I was a minority commissioner and the Obama administration where I was chair, we did what we thought was right, no matter what the administration thought. And I noticed that in Afi, you sent around in your prep outline, something about the coziness of the of the Obama administration with big tech, and a couple of articles about who was like giving talks at Facebook, and there's I'm not saying there's nothing to that, but we and I'm not saying we got everything right at the FTC or at the Justice Department, but we always try to do what we thought was right, no matter what the politics of it were, and that's hopefully that era will come back at some point, because it has been it was mostly lost. The FTC was an exception when I was there, but it's largely but it's even worse now. So hopefully it will. This is like a pendulum, and it'll go back to practical solutions to real problems. And then advice for young people. Ava. Consider at some point in your careers working in government. Your real income is not so bad. It's not great, but your psychic income is very high because you're working for the public.
Well, we want to be mindful of time, although I think we've already held you longer than we said we would. But it's been so great to meet you and talk to you, John. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with all of us about these very interesting topics. I want to offer you a chance to make any final remarks if anything comes to mind, but otherwise it's been such a pleasure, and thank you again.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you for letting me join you on the Periphery. It's a wonderful podcast, and maybe you'll have me back in 2 years if Congress passes privacy legislation.
Look, if you come back, we'll have you back. All right, thank you so much. As always, give us a review, subscribe, tell a friend, and we will see you. Probably not next week because we've got finals, but at least, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, give us some time to relax a little bit.